I stood at the kitchen counter on Christmas Eve holding a casserole dish that nobody was going to eat. The ham had been resting under foil for over an hour. The rolls I pulled from the oven were already cooling on the rack. I'd lit the 2 tall candles my wife always put out for the holidays, the ones she kept wrapped in tissue paper in the hutch, and I watched the wax run down the sides while I waited for headlights in the driveway that did not come. Nobody called. Not one of them. That was the night something inside me went quiet, in a way it had never gone quiet before. And in that quiet I started making decisions that I should have made years earlier. My name is Theodore Brennan. People who know me call me Teddy. I'm 68 years old. I spent 41 years in Ohio. Married a woman named Joanne for 36 of them. Raised 3 children in a brick colonial on a cul-de-sac in a town outside Cleveland. And built a heating and air conditioning company from a single-service van into a 14-truck operation that put food on a lot of tables besides mine. I buried Joanne after pancreatic cancer, chewed her up over 18 months, and turned her into someone I barely recognized at the end. What happened after I buried her is the part I'm going to tell you about. And before I get into it, I want to ask where you're watching from. Drop your city or your state in the comments. It helps me to know who's listening. There's more of us out here than people realize. Joanne and I met in 1986 at a county fair. She was working a 4-H booth and I was buying a corn dog, and I asked her if she knew a good place to get coffee that wasn't out of a thermos. She told me I was going to have to do better than that if I wanted a phone number. We were married 17 months later in the small Methodist church her grandfather had helped pour the foundation for. I had $284 in my checking account when we got married, and a truck with a bad transmission. She had a teaching degree and more patience than I deserved. We were not rich. We were not flashy, but we built something that worked, and over time it grew into a real life. Our oldest, my son Wesley, was the one who took to numbers early. He went to Ohio State and then to a graduate program in finance and ended up working for a big investment firm in Chicago. He married a woman named Brittany, who I never quite got a read on. She was always polite, always well-dressed, always asking questions that felt a half-step too pointed if he slowed down and thought about them. My middle child, my daughter Diane, became a nurse. She married a contractor named Greg and stayed in Ohio about an hour from us. My youngest, my daughter Megan, was the soft one, the crier, the one who needed extra hugs at bedtime when she was little, and extra reassurance well into adulthood. She married a man named Trey who sold commercial insurance, and they lived 2 towns over. Joanne and I paid for all 3 of their educations. Not one of them carried a dime of student debt. We helped Wesley with the down payment on his first condo in Chicago. We helped Diane and Greg buy a fixer-upper that needed a new roof before they could even close. We helped Megan and Trey with the closing costs on a starter home, and then again on the bigger house they moved into when their second baby came. Joanne and I were at every recital, every birthday, every graduation, every christening, every parent-teacher conference. My kids' kids ever needed a grandparent at. That was just how the 2 of us were. That was how we'd been raised, and it was how we raised our own. You show up. That was the rule. Then Joanne got sick. Pancreatic, stage 3 when they caught it, which is to say they caught it late, which is to say there were no good outcomes available to us, only a question of how long and how rough. I'll spare you the details of those 18 months, because some things don't fit into a story you tell on the internet. What I will tell you is that I scaled back the company. I put my operations manager Brian in charge of the day-to-day, and I told him I was only to be called if the office was actively on fire. I drove Joanne to chemo on Tuesdays and Fridays. I learned her medication schedule the way I used to memorize duct routing on a job site. I learned what foods she could keep down on a bad day. I learned how to help her into the bathtub without making her feel like she'd lost her dignity. I slept in a recliner next to our bed for the last 4 months because she couldn't be lifted easily, and I wanted to be there if she stirred in the night. The kids came when they could. Wesley flew in from Chicago a handful of times. Diane came on weekends when her shifts allowed. Megan called regularly and visited maybe twice a month. I understood they had their own lives. I wasn't keeping a tally. It was Joanne and me mostly, the way it had been Joanne and me for everything else. She died on a Sunday afternoon in October of 2014. I was holding her hand. She was 63. The funeral was packed. Joanne had taught 5th grade for 28 years, and she had a way of making children feel like they mattered, and a lot of those children, now grown, came and stood in the back of the church with their own babies on their hips. All 3 of my kids were there, all 5 grandchildren. Brittany, Wesley's wife, took charge of the reception afterward in a way that I was grateful for, because I was barely standing upright that day. The night of the funeral, after the casseroles had been wrapped in foil and the last neighbour had gone home, my 3 kids sat with me in the living room, and Wesley looked me in the eye and said, "Dad, we're going to take care of you. You're not going to be alone in this." Diane nodded. Megan was crying into my shoulder. I believed every word. The first couple of months they were good to me. Wesley called every Sunday like clockwork. Diane came over on Wednesdays after her shift. Megan would bring the kids by on Saturdays so the house wouldn't feel so empty. Brittany set up a meal delivery rotation with some of Joanne's church friends so I wouldn't have to cook. For a little while there it felt like the family had pulled in close, the way a family is supposed to when something terrible happens. Then it tapered off. I don't even remember exactly when. The Sunday calls from Wesley dropped to every other week, then once a month, then not at all. Diane's Wednesday visits became, "I'll try to swing by this weekend," and then those weekends stopped happening too. Megan still called, but the calls got shorter. I'd hear one of the grandkids horroring in the background and she'd say she had to go, and I'd hang up and sit in the kitchen and listen to the refrigerator hum. I told myself they were busy. Wesley had a big career. Diane was working 12-hour shifts. Megan had 2 little ones and the 3rd on the way. I was not going to be the kind of father who guilted his grown children into spending time with him. I figured the first year was just hard for everybody, and once we got past it, things would settle back into something close to what they used to be. That first Thanksgiving I assumed I'd be at one of their houses. Joanne and I had always rotated. 2 weeks out, I called Wesley. He said he and Brittany were keeping things small that year, just her parents and her sister, and that I'd understand because everyone was still raw. I said of course. I called Diane. She said Greg's mother was coming in from Arizona and she only had so much room. I called Megan. She said they were going to Trey's family's lake house. She said maybe Christmas. I made myself a turkey sandwich that Thanksgiving and watched the parade in my undershirt. And I told myself it was one bad year. Year 2. I offered to host Christmas. I told them I'd cook the whole spread. I told them I'd put up the big tree in the front window the way Joanne always did. I told them I'd buy the grandkids real presents, the kind they wanted, not the kind I thought they should have. Wesley said Brittany's family had already locked in Christmas morning. Diane was going to Greg's mother's again. Megan said she'd try, and then on Christmas Eve she sent me a text that said, "Love you, Dad, kids have the flu, rain check." I sat in my living room on Christmas morning with a stack of wrapped presents under a tree I'd put up by myself, and nobody came to pick anything up. I drove the whole stack of presents to a women's shelter the day after Christmas, and they were so grateful you'd have thought I'd given them gold. Year 3. I started reaching out earlier. I called in September. I offered to travel to them. I offered to host. I offered to meet at a restaurant. There was always a reason. That was also the year I started seeing pictures on Facebook. Wesley's family at a Bears game with Brittany's brother. Diane and Greg at a Halloween party hosted by some couple I'd never heard of. Megan's kids at a pumpkin patch. Whole gatherings, multiple grandkids in matching shirts, and me, nowhere in any of it. Year 4 I slipped on the back deck shoveling snow and tore something in my shoulder. I drove myself to the urgent care. They put me in a sling and told me no driving for 2 weeks. I called Wesley from the parking lot. He said that sounded miserable and he'd see what he could do. He never came. Diane said she'd send Greg over to plough my driveway. Greg never showed. I shoveled with my left hand for the rest of that winter and figured out how to button a shirt with my teeth and a kitchen tongs. Year 5, I found out my grandson Mason had made varsity baseball as a freshman. I found out from a man at the lumberyard whose nephew played on the same team. I sent Mason a card with $100 in it and a note telling him how proud his grandmother would have been. He sent me a thumbs up emoji over text. That was the only contact I had with that boy for the entire baseball season. I drove past his school on a Saturday in April and saw the games posted on the marquee, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot debating whether to go inside. I didn't. I knew if I showed up, somebody would make a face. Year 6. I had a heart episode, not a full heart attack, but bad enough that I drove myself to the emergency room at 2 in the morning thinking I might be dying. They kept me overnight. They cut me overnight. They put a stent in 2 days later. I lay in that hospital bed for 72 hours, and the only person who visited me was my next-door neighbour, Dolores, who was a widow herself, and who brought me a magazine and a small paper bag of homemade oatmeal cookies. I didn't tell my kids I was in the hospital. I had stopped expecting anything from them by then, and I was tired of asking and being disappointed. When I got home, I sat on my porch and watched the sun come up, and I thought about Joanne, and I thought about how she would have known what to do, and I thought about how she would have known what to do, and I thought about how alone I actually was. Year 7. I drove 3 hours to surprise my daughter Diane for her 40th birthday. I'd baked a coconut cake, her favourite, the one Joanne used to make for her every birthday since she was 6 years old. I'd called Greg the week before to confirm she'd be home. He said yeah, she'd be around. When I pulled up the street, I saw cars lined up on both sides. I saw balloons tied to the mailbox. I saw people through the front window holding wine glasses. I knocked on the door with the cake in my hands and Greg answered. His face did something complicated. He said, "Teddy, Diane didn't tell you?" I said, "Tell me what?" He said it was supposed to be just her work friends and a couple of girlfriends, that they hadn't really planned on family, that maybe I should have called first. I had called. I'd called him. I left the cake on the porch railing and I drove home. And I had to pull off onto the shoulder somewhere outside of Mansfield, because I could not see the road. Year 8 is when I started understanding that something else was going on underneath the silence. I got a call one afternoon from the senior banker at the credit union, where I'd kept my accounts for almost 30 years. He said it was a courtesy call. He said someone claiming to be a family member had contacted the branch asking about the structure of my accounts, whether I had any beneficiaries listed, whether I had a trust set up. They hadn't given a name. He thought I ought to know. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call. I knew it was Brittany. Wesley wouldn't have thought to do something like that on his own. Wesley was sharp with numbers, but he was not the type to pick up a phone and pretend to be someone he wasn't. Brittany, on the other hand, had been asking careful questions for years. At Easter dinners. At the occasional summer cookout I'd been invited to. Questions about the company. Questions about what Joanne and I had set aside for retirement. Questions about whether the house had appreciated since we bought it. I had always brushed them off as small talk because I wanted to believe my own son's wife was making small talk and not doing reconnaissance. I picked up the phone that same afternoon and I called Saul Whitman, who had been my lawyer for over 20 years. Saul had set up my company's corporate structure back in the 90s, and he had done every estate document Joanne and I had ever signed. I told him what the banker had said. Saul listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he told me to write down everything I could remember about the call, the date, the time, the exact words the banker had used, and to put it somewhere safe. He told me to call him if anything else strange happened. I wrote it all down on a yellow legal pad, and I put the pad in the gun safe in my office, and I went to bed. A few weeks later, I was at Wesley and Brittany's house for one of the rare dinners I'd been invited to that year. I was in the hallway by the powder room when I heard the two of them in the kitchen, talking low. They didn't know I was there. Brittany was saying something about needing to understand the picture before things got messy. She said the word estate twice. She said, "We just need to get ahead of this." Wesley said something I couldn't hear. Brittany said, "Let me deal with it. He likes me." I stood there in that hallway with my hand on the doorframe and I felt something cold move down through my chest. I went back to the dining room. I sat down. I ate my pot roast and I told a story about something funny that had happened at the gas station that morning, and I did not let one thing show on my face. But I knew. After that night I knew. Year 9 was the one that stays with me. My grandson Mason was graduating high school. I had not been to one of his birthday parties since he was 10 years old. I had not been included in a single Christmas in over 5 years. But a high school graduation felt like it should mean something, even to people who had stopped meaning much to each other. I called Megan because Mason was actually Diane's boy. But Megan was the one who tended to know what was going on in everyone's life, and I asked her if I could come to the ceremony. She said of course. She said she'd let Diane know. She said it should be fine. I drove the 2.5 hours the morning of the ceremony. I wore the navy sport coat I'd bought for Wesley's wedding 20-some years before, which still fit because I'm a stubborn man about my weight. I stopped at a Panera and bought a card and wrote a check inside it for Mason for $2,000. I figured he was going to need it for textbooks or a dorm fridge or whatever it was. Kids needed now. When I pulled into the parking lot of the high school, I saw Brittany standing by the front entrance handing out programs. She saw me coming. She walked right toward me before I'd even reached the sidewalk. She said, "Teddy, hi." She used the same voice you'd use on a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. She said today was really just immediate family, that the seating in the reserve section was tight, that nobody had mentioned to her that I was coming. I said Megan invited me. She said there must have been a miscommunication. She said she was sorry I'd driven all that way. She actually said the words, "You understand, right?" I looked past her toward the doors. I could see Wesley and Diane and Greg through the glass, all of them laughing at something. I could see balloons in the lobby. I looked back at Brittany and her face was the exact same face it had been at every Easter dinner where she'd asked me about the company. I said, "Sure, I understand." I turned around. I walked back to my truck. I put the card with the check in the glove compartment. I drove to the far corner of the parking lot and I sat there for I don't know how long. After a while I took out my phone and I opened the voice recorder. I started talking. I went through every year. Every missed call. Every photo I'd seen online of family gatherings I hadn't been told about. The bank call. The hallway conversation. The driveway in the snow. The hospital. The coconut cake. The empty Christmas tree. I talked for a long time. When I was done, I saved the file and I drove home, and I did not cry on the way because I was finished crying. I was thinking. I was deciding. Year 10 was Christmas Eve. I know I should have been past hoping by then. 10 years is a long time to keep setting plates for people who do not come, but I'd let myself get talked into one more try. And the way they'd let me get talked into it was almost worse than the silence. I'd called each of them. Not hinted. Asked. I told Wesley I needed one holiday. Just one. I told him I'd been alone for 9 of them. And I was not asking for an apology or a long conversation about anything that had happened. I just wanted my family in my house one more time. He said he'd see what he could work out. I called Diane. She said probably yes. I called Megan and she said it sounded wonderful and she would absolutely make it happen. I spent 4 days cooking. A ham. A turkey breast. Mashed potatoes and the green bean casserole with the fried onions on top the way Joanne always did it. Cornbread dressing. 2 pies. I went up into the attic and I brought down the box of Christmas decorations. Joanne had packed away the December before she got her diagnosis. I put up the tree. I hung her ornaments. I set the table for 14 because that was how many of them there were now once you counted spouses and grandkids, and the older boy's girlfriend that Diane had mentioned was getting pretty serious. I bought fresh flowers at the grocery store because Joanne always had fresh flowers at Christmas. I lit her candles. I put on the record she liked, the one with the choir. The ham came out of the oven at 4 in the afternoon. By 5, I'd called Wesley once. By 5:30, I'd called him twice and tried Diane. By 6, I'd called all 3 of them and gotten voicemail on every line. By 7, I sat down at the head of the table and I looked at the 13 empty chairs around me. The candles had burned down most of the way. The flowers were fully open. The food was sitting in its serving dishes going cold. I sat there until almost midnight. I didn't eat anything. I didn't get up. I sat and I looked at it. I needed to see it. I needed to look at exactly what 10 years of hope had brought me, and I needed to not flinch from it. Then I got up, covered everything in foil, walked into my office, took a clean sheet of paper out of the desk drawer, and wrote 2 words at the top in pen. The 2 words were, "I'm done." The next morning was Christmas Day, and I drove to Saul Whitman's house. I knew his address because I'd been to a retirement party there years before. I knew he'd be home with his wife and his grandkids, and I was sorry to be the man on his doorstep on Christmas. But I needed to start what I needed to start. He answered the door in a flannel robe. He looked at my face and didn't say anything for a second. Then he said, "Come on in, Teddy, the coffee's on." We sat at his kitchen table and I told him everything. The 10 years, the bank call, the graduation, the hallway, the voice memo on my phone, the money I'd quietly been moving around for my kids for years that none of them knew about. When I was done, he leaned back and said, "What do you want to do, Ted?" I said I wanted to sell the company. I wanted to sell the house. I wanted to move every penny I had into accounts they could not touch. I wanted to leave. And I wanted it done in a way that when they came looking, and they would come looking, there would be nothing to grab onto. He nodded. He said, "That's all squarely within your rights." He said, "Let's get started in the morning." Over the next 4 months, Saul and I took apart the life I'd built in Ohio. The HVAC company went first. I'd had 2 interested buyers for years. A regional outfit out of Columbus had been making polite inquiries since before Joanne died. We started formal negotiations in mid-January and closed in early March. The number that ended up on the wire was $1,870,000. Wesley had told me at a family dinner once that the company was a small operation and probably wasn't going to be worth much when I retired. I thought about that the morning I signed the papers. Next was a small piece of commercial land outside town that I'd held for 20 years, a strip with 2 retail units and a coin laundromat. It had been pulling in steady rent the whole time. That sold for $740,000. Then the investment accounts that Joanne and I had built up over 4 decades got restructured. Saul moved everything into a layered trust arrangement that was, as he put it, going to be a nightmare to challenge and cheaper to walk away from than to fight. The house went on the market the last week in March. It sold in 11 days for $690,000 to a young family with a baby and a yellow lab. I hope they fill those rooms with noise. What none of my kids knew the whole time I'd been driving back and forth to those hollow holidays was that I had been quietly subsidizing them. When Wesley got passed over for a promotion the year his second baby was born, and they fell behind on his mortgage, I covered 3 months of payments through a third-party arrangement Saul had set up that looked like a bank assistance program. When Diane's husband Greg blew out his back on a job site, and they were facing a stretch with no income, I paid the medical bills he didn't know were being paid. When Megan and Trey's youngest needed a tonsil surgery that wasn't fully covered by their insurance, I paid the difference through the hospital billing office under a different name. None of them ever asked where any of that money came from. They just took it. Every penny. Saul and I put together a complete record of every cent I'd quietly directed toward those 3 kids over the years. Every mortgage payment. Every medical bill. Every dollar. Each entry was dated, sourced, and notarized. If anyone ever wanted to claim later that I'd been confused or taken advantage of when I sold everything, that document was going to end that conversation before it started. I had a letter from my cardiologist and a letter from my primary care physician confirming I was in good health and of completely sound mind. Saul had me sit for a recorded video declaration about every decision I was making and why. We covered every angle. I also set up education trusts for all 5 of my grandchildren. Real money. Enough to cover 4 years of in-state tuition with a cushion. The trusts were structured so that no parent could touch a dime of it. The money would come to each kid at age 25, no earlier. Each trust was attached to a sealed letter from me. Not angry, not bitter, just honest. The story of who their grandmother was and who I had tried to be and what had happened over the last 10 years, written plainly, so that when those kids were old enough to ask questions, they would have my words to read and they could make up their own minds. I packed the house myself, 41 years of a life sorted into boxes over 3 weekends. I donated most of the furniture. I donated the good china. Joanne had kicked out the first year we were married. I gave the kids old things to the Historical Society because, by God, somebody ought to want them if the kids didn't. The hardest part was the workshop. I'd built a real woodworking shop in the back garage over the years. Decent table saw. A jointer. A planer. A wall of hand tools I'd been collecting since I was 22 years old. Joanne used to come out on Sunday afternoons with 2 cups of coffee and sit on a stool and just talk while I worked. I stood in that shop for a long time. Then I loaded the tools into the truck. They were coming with me. I changed my phone number on a Tuesday. I didn't leave a forwarding address with anyone except Saul. I drove out of that driveway on the 1st of May, 11.5 years almost, to the day after Joanne had died, and I did not look back. I drove straight through to Beaufort, South Carolina. Joanne and I had stayed there for our 20th anniversary, and she had said, half joking, that she'd like to be the kind of old people who sit on a porch and watch the marsh grass move with the tide. I'd remembered that. I bought a small 1-story house with a screened-in back porch and a workshop bigger than the one I'd left behind. I unloaded the truck over 2 days. I set up my bedroom and my kitchen, and on the 3rd day I set up the shop. I positioned the workbench the way I liked it. I hung the hand tools on the pegboard. I swept the concrete floor clean. Then I made a pot of coffee and I sat in a folding chair in the open garage door and I watched the neighborhood wake up. I did not check my phone. I did not wait for it to ring. That was what I noticed first in those early weeks. There was no waiting. The waiting was just gone. The low-grade hum that had run under every single day for 10 years. The constant background scan for whether this would be the week somebody finally called. The watching the calendar for holidays that might bring them back. The rehearsing what I'd say if Wesley showed up at the door. All of it was just gone. The mornings were mine. The afternoons were mine. Nobody was deciding whether I was worth a phone call. I joined a fishing club. Mostly men my age. Some older. We meet at the boat ramp at 5:45 on Saturdays, and we don't talk much, which suits me. I started building furniture again in the evenings. Nothing fancy. A side table. A bookcase. A bench for the front porch. The man 2 streets over, a retired electrician named Kenneth, comes by on Sundays and we drink coffee in the shop and don't say much, and that suits both of us. 3 months in, Saul called. He said Wesley had been to his office. Brittany had called 4 separate times. They'd hired some kind of locator service. Megan had been sending emails to my old address. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him to forward them my new email so they could write to me directly, because I wanted to see what they actually had to say when they had a clear channel. The emails came within hours of him doing it. Wesley said I was being irrational and that I had frightened everyone by disappearing. He used the word frightened twice. Diane said she didn't recognize this version of me. Megan said she could not believe I would walk away from my grandchildren the way I had, that it was not fair to them, that they missed me. Brittany did not email. A letter arrived 2 weeks later at Saul's office from an attorney suggesting that my recent financial decisions warranted a careful review, that there were concerns about undue influence and possible cognitive decline. Saul sent back the full package, the notarized record of every dollar I'd given them, the clean sale contracts, the doctor's letters, the video declaration. The opposing attorney went quiet inside of 3 weeks. I wrote one email and I sent it to all 3 of my kids at the same time. I told them I was healthy and safe and living better than I had in years. I told them I had spent a decade trying to stay in their lives and had been turned away at a high school graduation, left alone on Christmas with food for 14 people, and shut out of my own grandchildren's growing up. I told them not one of them had reached out for anything that wasn't money, until they realized there was money they could no longer find. I told them the trust funds were set and were entirely outside their reach. I told them the rest of my money was mine, earned over more than 30 years of work, and I would spend it or give it away however I chose. I told them that if any of them ever genuinely wanted me back in their lives, not out of obligation and not out of inheritance, the door was not closed, but it would be on my terms, and it would require showing up consistently, not just when it was convenient. Then I closed the laptop and I walked out to the shop and I started sanding a tabletop. The responses came in about what I'd expected. Wesley was angry. Diane said I was being unfair. Megan said I was punishing the grandchildren for things that weren't their fault. Nobody apologized. Nobody said I was right. After a few weeks, the messages tapered off. I figured they'd told themselves I was a bitter old man who had lost his perspective. They could tell themselves whatever they needed to tell themselves to sleep at night. It's been about 14 months now since I left Ohio. I wake up around 6. I make coffee. I sit on the screen porch when the weather's right and watch the marsh. Kenneth comes by on Saturdays for fishing. I donated a meaningful chunk of what Joanne and I had saved to a children's literacy foundation and to a hospice that took care of 2 of my friends in their final months. Those were causes she would have given to, and it felt right to send the money the way she would have sent it. Last month, I got an email from Megan. She said she had been seeing a therapist for almost a year. She said her therapist had helped her see things she had not wanted to look at. She said she had been wrong, that they had all been wrong, and that she was sorry. She asked if I would be open to talking. Slowly. No expectation. Just a beginning. I have read that email more times than I can count. Part of me is cautious. Part of me sees the little girl who used to cry harder than the other 2, and who needed an extra hug at bedtime and wonders if maybe this time she actually means it. I have not written back yet. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. The choice is mine now. In a way it never used to be. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not cooking for people who aren't coming. I'm not watching the driveway. I'm Theodore Brennan. I'm 68 years old. I worked hard my whole life, loved a good woman with everything I had, and raised 3 children who forgot I existed until they thought there was money in it. And then I did the one thing none of them expected. I walked away first, on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my finances in order. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it is that silence is not the same thing as acceptance, and patience is not the same thing as weakness. And at some point a man earns the right to stop waiting for people to treat him the way he deserves, and just go build a life that does not need them. I spent 10 years being forgotten. I'm spending the rest of my time being found. If this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. There are more of us out here than you'd think, and every single one of your stories matters too. I sit on this screen porch most evenings now, and I think about how long it took me to learn something my own father probably could have told me when I was 25 if I'd been willing to listen. Every action sets something in motion. Every silence teaches the person on the receiving end of it what you actually believe about them. When Wesley stopped returning calls and I told myself he was busy, I was teaching him that being unreachable carried no cost. When Diane skipped my hospital stay and I told myself she had her shifts to worry about, I was teaching her that my health was not worth rearranging a Tuesday for. When Megan promised to come for Christmas and didn't, and I cooked again the next year anyway, I was teaching all 3 of them that my hope was a renewable resource they could spend however they wanted. Cause and effect doesn't pause just because the people involved are family. If anything, with family it runs harder. because the trust runs deeper and the wounds compound quieter. What I understand now, sitting where I'm sitting, is that I confused patience with virtue for most of my adult life. I thought enduring was the same thing as loving. It is not. Real love has a spine in it. Joanne knew that. Joanne would have called Wesley out the second time he cancelled, not the 10th. She would have looked Brittany in the eye at that Easter table and asked her plainly what she wanted to know about our finances. And she would have asked it in front of everyone. I admired her for that, and I never quite learned it from her because I was the soft one in our marriage, and softness without honesty curdles into something else over time. It becomes a kind of permission. I gave my children permission to overlook me for 10 years, and they accepted that permission as completely as anyone would. The way back, if there is a way back for any of us, runs through 3 things. 1 is the honest reckoning. You have to look at what actually happened, not the story you've been telling yourself about it. 2 is the spine. You have to be willing to make a hard decision and live with the discomfort of it, because the alternative is a longer, quieter dying that nobody will notice. 3 is the work. You have to build something with your hands or your head or your time after you walk away, because walking away alone is not a life, it's just an exit. Kenneth and the fishing club and the half-finished bench on my porch are not consolation prizes, they are the actual point. If a younger man asked me what I'd do differently, I would tell him this. Show up for the people who show up for you. Pay attention to who calls when there is nothing to gain. And the day you realize you have been waiting on a porch that nobody is walking up to, get up off the porch. Your dignity is not a renewable resource. Spend it like it matters.